Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matthew Continetti, Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, co-hosted with the National Review Institute, William F. Buckley Jr. at 100, The State of American Conservatism. William F. Buckley Jr., born 100 years ago this November, was the most influential American journalist of the 20th century. And since today's event reached full capacity several days ago, I think it's safe to say that his influence or interest in him has not diminished. And that's about, now 17 years since he died. In 1950, the literary critic Lionel Trilling famously wrote that American conservatism was defined by irritable mental gestures, not real ideas. But in the years and decades that followed, Buckley and friends would prove him wrong. Buckley transformed American conservatism from a shapeless, often humorless entity into a revolutionary political force that was a joy. As a 25-year-old in 1951, he published his first book, God and Man at Yale. 4 years later, he founded the National Review. By the time of his death in 2008, as I mentioned, he had inspired, built, and guided the modern American conservative movement. Buckley's output was gargantuan. In print, he published thousands of columns and articles. He wrote more than 60 books. On television, he hosted more than 1,500 episodes of Firing Line. As an institution builder, he helped found not only National Review, but the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, Young Americans for Freedom, and the Conservative Party of New York State, which we need now more than ever. When he died at age 82, Buckley was at his desk. Another deadline loomed. It's no surprise that Buckley's life has captivated biographers. There are, I think, about half a dozen biographies of Buckley that have been written, some in print, some out of print. Authors have explored his personal and political evolution, but none have chronicled his life in such a comprehensive fashion as Sam Tanenhaus, whose new book, Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America, is interesting, yet imperfect. At a sprawling 1,000 pages, Buckley's biography still can't contain the full magnitude of his character and accomplishments and his movement, his ideas. Tanenhaus's book does, however, contain several insights. I think perhaps the most significant is that Buckley's life was, in a sense, defined by a paradox. His principles and personality never seemed to change over the course of his public life, but his movement, the movement he helped create and define, shape-shifted often, and still is. Throughout his life, Buckley stayed true to what he called the paradigm of individual freedom consistent with law and order. Meanwhile, American conservatism's list of issues and cast of characters kept changing. Buckley went from isolationism in 1941 to foreign intervention against communism starting in around 1950. He supported Robert Taft, then Joseph McCarthy, then Barry Goldwater, then, briefly, Richard Nixon. Ronald Reagan's presidency was the culmination of everything Buckley had worked toward. But when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the conservative movement split once again. Patrick Buchanan advocated a return to the old ways, non-intervention abroad, resistance to liberalism at home. Buckley sided with Buchanan's opponents, who believed that America had a responsibility to guarantee international security in the post-Cold War world. But since Buckley's death, the right has shifted again. Today, the right is prioritizing national sovereignty, shies away from military force, and is enticed by Nixon's approach to government intervention in the economy on behalf of the hard hats. How would Buckley respond to these new circumstances? We can only make reasonable guesses. I think he would oppose big government and its partisans in both parties. He would argue for free enterprise and a strong civil society. He would skewer liberal intellectuals, and he would remain unabashedly patriotic, proud of his country, its people, its ideals, and all that it has accomplished. How the right will continue to evolve is another question entirely. As the conservative movement faces an unexplored, uncertain future, the undiscovered country, I'm joined this afternoon by a distinguished panel to explore what might come next. We'll discuss the lessons conservatives should take from Buckley's life and legacy as we navigate this new political and cultural environment. Our panelists are experts on American conservatism and its history and American politics in general. In the center, Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies here at AEI and the founding editor of National Affairs. To my right, Jonah Goldberg holds the Asmus Chair in Applied Liberty at American Enterprise Institute and is also the editor of The Dispatch and the host of the Remnant podcast. And at the end of the panel there, Ramesh Ponnuru is a non-resident senior fellow at AEI, the editor of National Review magazine, and a columnist for the Washington Post. After I moderate a discussion with the panelists, we'll open the floor to audience Q&A. Hopefully have time for a couple of questions. If you are watching online, please submit any questions you might have to Guy, that's guy.denton@aei.org, or send a question via X using the hashtag WFB100. But before we begin, I'd like to invite Chuck DeFeo, the CEO of National Review, to the stage to share some brief remarks about Buckley's legacy and its relevance to the mission of AEI. Chuck is as I say, the inaugural CEO of National Review and a former Chief Digital Officer of the Republican National Committee. And please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Chuck.
Matt, let me see if you can hear it. Matt, thank you for having me with you. That's such a kind introduction. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here with you. Sir Isaac Newton said, "If I can see further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Among the many reasons I am with you this evening is because many years ago, I began to read not only Bill Buckley, but also most of our panelists. And my understanding of our principles and our movement has been deepened by my reading Matt. I have seen further because of the founder of our movement and because of these men. And it is such a privilege to be invited here to be with you tonight. How do you sum up the life of William F. Buckley? For Sam Tanenhaus, it took nearly 1,000 pages, and he was still left us wanting. By the way, the Audible version is 31 hours long. I'm going to do my best, but there was a reason this was scheduled at 4 o'clock. So I hope you didn't make any plans after this. I'll keep my remarks focused on one question, and that has been one that many of his recent critics have asked. Was the conservative movement that began when William F. Buckley founded National Review successful? Well, to bring about societal change, you need 3 essential elements: ideas, the ability to popularize those ideas, and a coalition of people who will bring those ideas to fruition. If that's our criteria, how successful was he? As Matt pointed out in the 1950s, conservative thought was described as irritable mental gestures, which seemed to resemble ideas. Buckley saw the intellectual vacuum and sought to fill it. In National Review's original mission statement, we all know stand athwart and out of place. But there's another line that is just as important and just as defining. Ideas have to go into exchange to become or remain operative. With National Review, he created a platform for ideas and firmly rooted our movement as one driven by ideas. Today, we take for granted that we have excellent institutions like the American Enterprise Institute, and that so effectively makes the case for expanding freedom, individual liberty, and for free enterprise here and abroad. Just like National Review, AEI exists to put ideas into exchange, and I'm grateful for their work. I'm grateful for the institution and the work that they do with us. Did he form a coalition of people that will bring these ideas to fruition? Milton Friedman famously said that Buckley's greatest talent was his ability to develop friendships. From the founding of National Review with giants like Frank Meyer, Russell Kirk, Whittaker Chambers, Brent Bozell, and James Burnham, to cultivating policy leaders like Barry Goldwater, his brother James L. Buckley, and Ronald Reagan, he brought fellow travelers together. Ultimately, the best answer to the question, though, is from George Will. And he didn't need 1,000 pages. Without Buckley, no National Review. Without National Review, no Goldwater nomination. Without the Goldwater nomination, no conservative takeover of the Republican Party. Without that, no Reagan. Without Reagan, no victory in the Cold War. Therefore, Bill Buckley won the Cold War. While we won the Cold War, the fight against relativism and central planners continues, and the advocacy for a philosophy of freedom continues as well. We could not ask for a better partner in this fight than AEI, and I am deeply grateful. A special thanks to Robert Doerr for his leadership, to the entire AEI team for their indispensable work, and to our panelists for the important discussion they're about to have with us. One final note, I hope to see you all at our Buckley Prize Dinner in Palm Beach, Florida on November 5th of this year. It'll be a special centennial celebration of our founder, as well as our awardees, Governor and First Lady DeSantis and Art Pope. If you have any questions, please reach out to Adam Novak or Noel Carter with our team. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chuck. Well, why don't we just dive right into it with a little bit of a discussion about the man, Buckley. I just want to go down the panel and ask each of you, what was your chief experience with Bill Buckley, whether it was professional or from a distance? What did he mean to you? How did he draw you into American conservatism? And we'll just begin with you, Ramesh.
Well, I met Bill via our mutual friend Axel von Wintergren, who was the star of one of the Blackford Oaks novels, which I was reading in junior high and high school. I got to know him in the last 12 years of his life when he had slowed down some, although his semi-retirement was more active than the prime of most people's lives. And I saw him most frequently at editorial meetings, particularly the editorial dinners that he would hold at his Masonette in New York every 2 weeks, which were an experience that I don't think I've ever had anywhere else. For example, there were the tables of 8 to 10 people, and there'd be little cigarette holders at each place setting, and little ashtrays as well, which I guess maybe is an older style of entertaining, and always a special guest, often, although not always, a liberal or left-winger who had entered into the lion's den. And there'd always be a topic of discussion at some point, which could be, matters of state, or it could be, one dinner was devoted, this was during the Lewinsky scandal, entirely to a discussion of the best adjective to describe Bill Clinton's behavior. I believe that the winning entry at the end of the discussion was iniquitous.
Yuval?
Well, I may be at a bit of a disadvantage on this panel because I didn't really know Bill Buckley personally well at all. I met him a few times, but I wouldn't say I ever really had a conversation with him. I got to know him, I guess, in the way that most people who admired him did, which is as a reader of his and as a viewer of his. I encountered his writing, his columns in the Star Ledger in New Jersey as a high school student, maybe middle school student, I don't know. I was that nerdy. And in high school, I would get this weekly, I think, publication that would come in the mail that was just a bunch of syndicated conservative columnists. Sort of crazy now to think about it, and I'm sure it's still somewhere in my parents' home. It would always start with Bill's 2 columns from that week, and I still remember this kind of sensation you get in reading those columns, especially maybe as a younger person. It's this thing that great teachers do, which is you get the feeling that if you worked a little harder, you might be able to understand this. Not much harder, but a little harder, because I'm not quite getting you, but it seems worth the work. And I think, if you know Harvey Mansfield, this is how he teaches. This sense of like, I don't know, man, but if I gave this a little more time, I'd be a lot smarter. I think a lot of Bill's columns had that feeling about them, but they also had a sense of just joy and a kind of taking pleasure in both praise and critique, in analysis, in picking on somebody and patting somebody on the back. There was always a sense that this was supposed to be fun. And I think if there's something I miss the most about Bill's writing at this point, it is that sense that this is really supposed to be enjoyable, that this is about how a great country should govern itself. I think that attitude was so much a part of what he brought to the table. And as a reader, as a viewer, along with a sense of a kind of intellectual seriousness, that there were real ideas here, just that sense of fun was always exciting to me about him.
Jonah?
Sure. So in the blissfully short bio that Matt read, he left out a somewhat salient fact, is I was at National Review for 20 years. And I didn't interact with him as much as Ramesh did. But I too had been to his it wasn't so much that they were cigarette holders, it was cigarette dispensers, where you hold this little knob in the center and the cigarettes flower out. And that was the last, I mean, other than some diners in Kentucky, I don't think I'd ever seen those anyplace else. But the first time I went to his, and also have never used I grew up in New York City, never heard anyone use the term maisonette, except to describe Bill Buckley's house, and it was incredibly intimidating. I thought, first of all, just going to National Review, never mind Bill Buckley's house, that it was just going to be Latin puns and Chesterton quotes all night long, right? And the thing where I agree with Matt, I have not read the whole book, but I've been dipping in and out of it. The one thing I think that I can, maybe not the only thing, but certainly the most important thing that I can agree with Tanenhaus completely on, is that Buckley was this amazing listener. You'll hear from a lot of people how he's a great conversationalist, and he was, but that part's obvious. That lots of people, you're not necessarily a great conversationalist because you use words like sesquipedalian to, in nonchalantly. It's that he could shut his mouth and he would listen to you so carefully and so attentively that it kind of made you feel like you were one of the only people in the world that mattered to him. And that is incredibly flattering for a little policy nerd kid going to dinner at Bill Buckley's house. And it's one of the things, it was one of his true gifts that he could, in my 20 years at NR, I would meet people who had met him, would send him a letter, he would write back, exchange a couple more letters, and then the correspondence would end, and then 2 years later, Bill's secretary would find the address and send this guy in Peoria a note saying, hey, I'm going to be giving a lecture at the university, would you like to come? And of course the person comes, and not only does he get a ticket waiting for him, he gets the seat next to Bill Buckley at the head table with the governor on the other side of that kind of thing. And when he was talking to you, he just talked to you. And he didn't care that it was a governor or a senator or anything like over there. And some of it was probably artificial, but it helps you understand how gifted he was to pull all these weird personalities together and keep them sort of on side as much as he did. I mean, yeah, you lost Ayn Rand, but she was a difficult person. And I guess I'm supposed to have a story. The only story I have was that my first National Review cruise, because as Ramesh can attest, we for a long time worked at a cruise tourism company that put out a right-wing magazine on the side. It was one of these planes, trains, and automobiles thing. I actually spent the night that Gore conceded the 2000 election in a hotel in Puerto Rico because I missed my flight. And we finally get to the boat, and it's sweaty and it's crazy, and I have to rush straight to my first panel with William F. Buckley, and he's moderating it. And he says, we have been discussing whether or not excessive lachrymosity in elected leaders is necessarily deleterious to their overall masculine blah, blah. And do you agree, Jonah? I had no clue what lachrymosity meant. And it was all about George H.W. Bush crying in public was the backdrop of it all. And so my first panel appearance with William F. Buckley, I came across as just a monstrous idiot who did not answer the question remotely, and he was very gracious about it, and we just tangoed on.
Well, you had it easy because he was a terrifying moderator. And on one of those panels, during the Q&A, he said, I will not try to render his accent, but he said that I had not answered that gentleman's question. And of course, you can't say, That's right, Bill. I didn't want to answer the gentleman's question. It was a dumb question.
You know, I mean, listening to all of your descriptions, you get the sense of the qualities that define a leader, and in particular, a leader of a movement, someone who is able, kind of through his character, to bring these elements together, and also to appeal to young people, which I think is not commented on enough. I mean, just in my own case, you know, the first encounter I had with Bill Buckley's public personality was probably as a 10-year-old watching the Disney cartoon Aladdin, where Robin Williams, as the voice of the genie, imitates William F. Buckley Jr., and the animation actually turns that cartoon into a caricature of Buckley. And then I was lucky enough to, I think, probably I'm the last generation of conservatives to know Buckley and visit the apartment in Park Avenue. And even then, in the fall of 2002, as a junior at Columbia, he insisted that I sit next to him during the cocktail hour and next to him at dinner. And I knew very little about what was going on. The topic was economics. Larry Lindsay, formerly of AEI, was, I think, the guest of honor. Larry Kudlow was there. That's when I first met Larry Kudlow. And Buckley turned to me, just as you've heard described, and asked for my opinion on the views, on the matter at hand. And the only difference was he was very bad at names. So he leaned over and said, "What do you think, Paul?" Now again, I'm 21, I'm a junior in college, and I'm not going to challenge this great man that is kind enough to invite me to dinner and have me sit next to him. So as the conversation went elsewhere at the table, I leaned over and I said, "Mr. Buckley, it's Matthew." And it came my round again later. Paul. So for that night, I was Paul Continetti, and I've always thought maybe my parents had misnamed me, but he made the effort. I want to turn a little bit to the movement that those qualities helped define. You know, it's striking, Buckley in a few occasions distanced himself from the label conservative. He once said that, you know, temperamentally I'm not of the breed of conservative. And then in one of his later collections of columns, Happy Days Are Here Again, the subtitle read, "Reflections of a Libertarian Journalist," not a conservative journalist. And I'm wondering, Yuval, if you could maybe comment a little bit about the nature of that conservative coalition. We've heard it described as a fusion between traditionalists and libertarians. It seems to me that it was pretty heavy on the libertarian side when Buckley was making his bones and creating this. And that's not so much the case today. I mean, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the fact that temperamentally he was not simply a conservative was actually very important to his success. He wasn't dour. He wasn't particularly pessimistic. A coalition that truly consists of just conservatives really would have a personality problem. And I think that Buckley always understood that part of the role he had was to provide a certain kind of personality to what would otherwise have to be counted as a very difficult coalition. And I think he was patching together people of related but different views from the very beginning. The striking thing to me about the Tanenhaus book, it's I don't know if he meant it to be this way, but it's actually kind of reassuring to read today about the 50s and early 60s, because everybody was crazy then too. There was no shortage of kooks in that circle. And there was a certain amount, I mean, I think it's easy to overstate how much of a role Buckley played consciously in kind of tamping that down or controlling this or that. But he just kind of kept everybody together in a way that I think was essential to coalition building. There's no question it leaned in a, you might say, an individual rights direction for him. Again, if you think about the moment, if you think about the challenges of the time, it's not hard to see how the anti-left coalition of the middle of the 20th century would be somewhat libertarian. But I do think that from very early on, the emphasis on fusing, you might say, traditionalism and dynamism, which are not natural allies, was in a sense what he was doing, and it was present in his own temperament and personality, in his own thought. But I think he also brought people together who represented the different facets of that coalition and were looking to find ways to hang together. And so, it seems to me that that work of coalition building was really central to what he was doing. He thought to be effective, the American right needed to hang together without fully making sense, as any large coalition would. And he really made that his work in a way that's pretty unusual. Took that as his role in that period in a way that I think paid dividends in a big way.
Ramesh, coming into the movement at the time that you did in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, which had been kind of the glue holding the two wings of conservatism together for much of the 20th century. What was your sense of this balance between social conservatism and economic conservatism? Did it seem in tension in the mid-late 1990s? Was the movement kind of distracted by the Bill Clinton phenomenon? How did the pieces fit together when you started off?
Well, the tension's built in. The tension always existed and it always has to be managed. I do think that there is a tendency these days to read back into the fusionist conservatism of, let's say, mid-50s to really just pre-Trump, more libertarianism than there actually was. Buckley was certainly not doctrinaire about his free market sympathies, although those sympathies were obviously present. And of course, he made a lot of room and was influenced a lot by Whittaker Chambers, who of course famously said that conservatism had to make its peace with at least some elements of the welfare state if it were going to be viable. And Bill had a very practical frame of mind. I mean, if you think back to his 1965 run for mayor, there was quite a lot of law and order in that race, and not just kind of pure opposition to government. But it's also true, as you've all alluded to, I mean, we have the backdrop of communism and a kind of faith in central planning among intellectuals in the West that is no longer really present. And so it's partly, I think, just a change in circumstances that has made the right less libertarian than it was back then. But also, I think there was a more doctrinaire kind of libertarian-inflected conservatism around the Tea Party era that we have read back into its predecessors.
Jonah, I'm interested in your views on this. You've written about it many times, but I'd also like to introduce maybe an element that occurred later in Buckley's life, which was the Iraq War. And the Iraq War of 2003, he had, for those of us who follow these things very closely, very complicated views on the subject, supporting it, then saying that he would not have supported it given the events that ensued, then kind of calling for some sort of withdrawal, then sort of backing the surge. I guess I'd approach the question with you this way. Was there a moment, say, in the beginning of the 21st century when I became involved in the conservatism in the United States, when national security, the war on terror kind of almost displaced this fundamental tension between traditionalism and libertarianism?
Yeah, let me tack on to the first part of the conversation. Yeah. I think, I know these are fighting words, but I'm willing to make some defense of the Lionel Trilling irritable mental gestures thing, because what he was talking about in that passage, which I've quoted negatively a zillion times, but then I decided to go back and read it in this broader context and I've been rethinking it, is like part of his point was that the American consensus is liberal. This is that in the classical sense, that this is a liberal nation, that conservatives in America are trying to conserve, first and foremost, the US Constitution and the principles of the founding, which were in their day liberal principles. And then you add in this sort of weird point, which we're sort of dancing around, is that up until the 1950s, liberal did not have an ideological connotation the way it does now. Taft refers to himself as a liberal into the 1950s, as does Joe McCarthy. And it's talking about men of liberal spirit and that kind of thing. And at the end of the day, that older meaning of liberal, being of liberal spirit, curious, open-minded, willing to engage with the world and ideas, the liberal of liberal arts. Bill Buckley was that kind of liberal. I mean, he was a curious guy who was perfectly willing to argue with Baldwin and Jesse Jackson and all these people on his show. He liked that stuff. Some of his best friends were on the left. He was liberal-minded in that sense. And on the fusionism question, I generally agree with you guys that we can read too much pure libertarianism into fusionism, in part because a lot of its critics did. I mean, Murray Rothbard, what he called Frank Meyer a libertarian Mankay or something like that.
That's right.
But the point I would make, tying the 2 points together, is that the American character is liberal in a certain sense, in that older meaning of it. And what Bill Buckley, I mean, people think that Bill Buckley, one of the things that Tanenhaus' book is good about is that he points out, Bill Buckley was not this patrician New Englander that we all thought he was, or a lot of people thought he was. He spent the first 7 years of his life raised in Mexico, spoke English as a second language. His dad was like a wildcat oil entrepreneur, had much more Southern roots and Western roots than he did New England roots. And in that sense, he was because he doesn't sound like it, it's hard for people to believe, but he was actually a sort of a quintessentially American figure. And that tension that Meyer talks about in fusionism wasn't coalitional. He traces it back to Athens and Jerusalem and says that these competing tensions of freedom of order and liberty and virtue are written into the DNA of Western civilization, and they find their greatest expression in the American tradition. And I think that
Which is why Meyer hated the term fusionism.
Yeah, and that's why I think in a lot of ways American conservatism is so different than continental conservatism, because what it's conserving is this, as Bill Murray says in Stripes, we're not Watusis. We were kicked out of every decent country in the world, and Americanism is just weird compared to these other countries. In terms of the foreign policy stuff, I think one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is Bill Buckley, by the time the Iraq War is coming around, and I don't mean this to denigrate him or say that he lost his edge or all that, but he was an old guy. And I think he kind of had this approach to the Iraq War of saying, this just doesn't it was sort of a curmudgeonly kind of, reaction to it at times. And I think that one of the things that we definitely saw at National Review, and we got a lot of grief from a lot of different places during that period, was there were a lot of people who thought, sort of like the swapping at the idol for the bag of sand in Indiana Jones, that they could just take the Cold War and put the war against Islam in its place, and everyone could stay in their positions. And it didn't work. Not to say that the war against, the war on terror didn't have its arguments and stuff. It just wasn't like the Cold War. And
the boulder is Donald Trump in that analogy.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah. It just didn't work, and here he comes. And so I think that the attempt to sort of pigeonhole the war on terror stuff as the new Cold War paradigm, I think it's one of the things that knocked the right off of some of its tracks.
One more.
Matt, can I say one more thing about this?
Please.
I think the tension between the traditionalism and the libertarianism is actually a key piece of what's missing in the Tanenhaus book. You almost don't want to say something's missing because the book is very long. He got a 1,000-page book published, which is really an achievement today. But the way that it's structured, if you look at it, there's a section that covers 5 years in the 1960s, 8 years in the 1950s, and then there's a section that covers 35 years from the mid-70s to the end of Bill's life. And that is the period we're kind of talking about. I think it's a very, very interesting time to look at through Bill Buckley, and the book just really doesn't get that whole stretch. And the Cold War ends halfway through that period, but it's told in a very weird way. And I think
I guess Sam needed more time.
Yeah, right.
To get that last bit in. 27 years wasn't enough.
If you step back from that period and think about the right, though, I think one way to describe what's going on in the coalition is that over and over, American conservatives say to themselves and the country, We've become too libertarian. We need to re-emphasize social conservatism of various kinds. In a way, that's actually what Nixon said. That's very much what Ronald Reagan said, that he's not a green eye shade guy. He's focused on these ideals. It's what happens in the wake of Reaganism. It's how George W. Bush runs. We've been too libertarian. We need to focus on social conservatism. It's what a lot of what followed Bush was about. It's what Trump, in a lot of ways, had to say to conservatives. It's an important and, I think, engaging thing to say, but what happens is the right says this to itself, and then what it actually does is basically just libertarian economic policy, right? So that if you step back and put the rhetoric aside and say, what did they decide to prioritize? It's generally a tax bill that reduces the top rate. And we're doing it again, by the way, right now. And so I think that the way in which the coalition deals with that tension is really worth thinking through and looking over that period, that stretch of time that the book just somehow manages to squeeze into the end.
It may have to do with the kind of cross-cutting interests of a movement and a political party, right?
Yeah.
Which the political party and the way it's structured is definitely interested more in the economic policies and who gets what where, whereas the movement has this more kind of expansive view of what makes for a flourishing society. Mm-hmm. One other question about Buckley and how it relates to kind of the changing movement before we talk about the present moment and the future. Ramesh, anyone who reads the biography that's out by Tanenhaus, anyone who watches the last year's documentary on PBS about the life of Buckley, The Incomparable Mr. Buckley is the title of the documentary. Anyone really who writes about it, and I write about this in my book, John Judas wrote about it in his earlier biography of Buckley, deals with the issue of race and National Review's positions on the civil rights movement and defense of segregation in the 1950s. And our colleague Chris Scalia, who's here, mentioned to me the other day, says for so many conservatives who came of age with Gen X, or I'm a edge
we prefer
millennial.
The greatest generation.
Yeah, the greatest generation, yeah. Those conservatives, and probably even some late boomer conservatives, had no idea about this past when they joined the movement. And because, of course, Buckley had changed his positions on these issues, right? So I'm curious about how you discovered that past about the conservative movement and National Review and the civil rights era, and then how you would understand that progression from a point where Buckley could write an editorial in defense of the South in 1957, but also then say that Martin Luther King, he got Martin Luther King Jr. wrong, and that he touring cities with the Urban League in 1969, we needed a Marshall Plan for the cities.
Right, and then in 1980 he writes a column saying that the country really needs a black president.
A black president, yes.
Well, I mean, I think there was a real evolution in his views that has to do in part with his upbringing and his father, and Tanenhaus gets at that quite extensively in the book. But just to widen our aperture a little bit about that, I think that one of the things conservatives, when they try to reckon with this history, have a problem with is that so many elements of conservative thinking, traditionalism, originalism, federalism, libertarianism, all of these things combine to push you toward the wrong answer in the mid-1950s and early 1960s. And Bill, I think Bill's in 2004 when he looks back on all of it, particularly when he looks back to sort of the 55 to 65 period, where I think he did, his record then is not defensible. He says, I thought that you could have had an evolution without federal intervention, right. And I was wrong. Right. It reminds me of something Chris DeMuth wrote about his becoming a conservative, having been one of the original one of the later, I should say, mid-neoconservatives, that he came to appreciate later on the force of some of the arguments Goldwater made against the Civil Rights Act, but he wished that those arguments had been made in the course of an argument for ultimately voting yes. Mm-hmm.
Of course, the conservative coalition, the Republican coalition today, has kind of sloughed off a lot of that history, and we now are in a moment where the Republican coalition is described as a multiracial working class party, the kind of a populist conservative motivating force. I'm wondering, is there a way in which the right today resembles the pre-Buckley right? In the different sects involved, in the different factions, the lack of a kind of consensus leader?
Yeah, I think in some respects you'd have to say that's true. Maybe the right today resembles something like the pre-war right, the pre-World War II right, without that kind of organizing principle that gave people a big question around which they could decide which side they're on. Yeah, I think in some ways today's right is divided along a question that has less to do with the traditional kind of left-right axis and more to do with what we might think of as the up-down axis, the few and the many axis that is older than left and right, more fundamental to politics. Populism has always been an element of conservatism in the United States, an important element. But I think it's worth seeing populism and conservatism in a sense as different factions of a plausible coalition of the right. And for most of our lifetime, conservatism was the dominant faction, so that you could think of populism as an outsider force very naturally, both in our politics largely and within the coalition of the right. Over the last 10 years or so, populism has been the dominant force on the American right. And it has had to adjust itself to being the insider, which is hard to do and hard for populism to do. And the right has had to adjust itself around that reality too. I think I mean, in some ways that move toward populism on the right is happening all over the democratic world. It's not simply a function of something interior to the history of the American conservative movement. If you think of populism broadly as rooted in a suspicion of elite power, this period is a time when populism is just simply very powerful on the left and the right in different ways. And conservatism now is more distinct, I think, from populism than it's tended to be in the modern history of the right. But that division has always been there. Those elements have always been there. There's a lot of populism in the mid-century American conservative coalition. It was very important to that coalition. It was intellectually a very serious part of that coalition.
There was part of it with Buckley, right? His famous comment about the Boston telephone directory.
Absolutely. I think it's essential to a piece of what conservatism had to offer. But to my mind, what was centrally not driven by populism for Buckley was the sense of joy in politics, which begins from a commitment, a politics that starts in what we love and are defending, rather than a politics that starts in what we hate and are opposing. And populism begins from suspicion, from a fear that what we have is at risk of being taken away by powerful people, and just generally has a different tone than Buckley tended to have. But there was a lot of populism in Bill Buckley.
But there's also a change in circumstances that's relevant to that change, in that when he starts in the mid-1950s, there is a sense among a lot of conservatives that the country is basically fine and in good hands, and in some ways conservative hands. So he has to rouse the alums of Yale to say, "Lo, this institution is not actually taking care of the values that you think it is." And he's very successful in it. But at this point, that is certainly not the way conservatives feel about the sort of commanding heights of our culture, even at a time when, of course, conservatives do have a lot of power.
Jonah, I want to turn to you. In one of your previous answers, you were talking about Trilling and liberalism and kind of the liberal spirit. And of course, today, it's not enough to talk about a conservative movement. You have to talk about a broader right, which includes post-liberal thinkers and activists. Is this new? I mean, we were talking about maybe historical precedents for the era. Is it something that is a more direct challenge to kind of the American conservative movement's understanding of American history and our political institutions, and how should we respond to it?
Yeah, so the best rule of thumb is nothing is new. You know, I get very frustrated with some of the post-liberals these days who, and for those of you who don't know what post-liberalism is, you came to the wrong event. But post-liberalism is this diverse, there are different flavors of it, but it's this idea that liberalism, as in Enlightenment liberalism, has kind of served its purpose, and we need to move beyond it. And I'll always point out that Marx is the first really famous post-liberal. But you go back, and I mean, you guys all know this stuff as well as I do. Bill Buckley's brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, the one who's the father of the Media Research Center guy, he breaks with Bill, launches a magazine called Triumph in the 1960s that, I'm not trying to be ad hominem here, but basically argues that America should basically become a papal state, right? And that we need to move beyond liberalism. He hates fusionism, he hates all that stuff. The thing fails, but those arguments were serious arguments and they were made in a time, and I'm always amazed at how so many of these post-liberals pretend or seem to think that they stumbled on these arguments as if they're new. You have this Curtis Yarvin guy who's very popular in the sort of J.D. Vance, you know, tech bro world, who thinks he stumbled on a new idea called monarchy, which we've kicked the tires on monarchy a few times in the last 10,000 years. The sociology is new, sort of, and part of it is getting at what Yuval is talking about with how populism was never the dominant faction, at least not for very long. And the only time you could claim, I think, that the populism was dominated the party was the brief McCarthy period. And people forget that there were a lot of McCarthyites in the Democratic Party too, so it doesn't have the same overlay that it does now. In fact, some of the most effective McCarthyites were in the Democratic Party. And so what bothers me, and what I think is the real problem with the right these days, there are many problems with the right these days, but one of the real problems is something that Whittaker Chambers talks about quite explicitly in Witness, which is what he calls the popular front mind. And he was talking about the left at the time, about how there is this, you know, no enemies to the left mentality that makes liberal progressivism back then seem monolithic. And that was the thing that Buckley was fighting against, was this sense that even like the mainstream institutions like the New York Times and even the moderate wing of the Republican Party, they were all sort of in on this dangerous sort of collusion with communism and whatever, and he had to we stand before history yelling stop to all of it, right? From Yale to, you know, the Ripon Society or whatever it is. And I think the problem now is that there's a big chunk of the right that has a popular front mentality that says, no enemies to the right, don't shoot inside the tent, don't have fights amongst yourselves, aim all of your ammo leftward because that's the existential foe that is going to destroy us and all of this nonsense. And very much the Flight 93 election mentality. And the problem with that, by my lights, is I think the singularly best thing about American conservatism since 1945 was its willingness to have intramural arguments, to debate amongst ourselves. And when you're willing to debate amongst yourselves and that means you're taking ideas seriously. It's what this place was always about. We don't have a party line at AAI, and scholars are encouraged to disagree with each other. National Review, one of the great things about National Review was its liberalness, in the sense that, you know, the next issue after the editorial about segregation, which was so terrible, there were dissenters in the pages of National Review.
Including Brent Bozell.
Including Brent Bozell. When I started the corner at National Review, the point of the corner was to show that conservatism, show that conservatism is not monolithic and that there are important and interesting disagreements amongst ourselves. National Review has always encouraged this sort of, one of its great traditions is to have someone write the conservative case for ... something truly horrible and evil, right? And then we all beat up on it, and it's an act of hygiene. And I think because
That's why we employed Jonah so long.
that's right. That's why the Republican coalition is so problematic for the conservative movement, because the Republican coalition is grounded almost entirely on a cult of personality, about agreeing with one man and not and not embarrassing him or contradicting him. And because a lot of conservative intellectuals are very like Bill Buckley was, very invested in the health and fate of the Republican Party, there is a cross-contamination. There's a blood-brain barrier problem, where to be a good conservative intellectual also means you can't get too much on the wrong side of what the Republican priority is, which is this fidelity to the sort of the MAGA thing. And I think that is why conservatism is in some of the mess that it's in.
You know, I think when we think about sort of Bill's relevance to the contemporary American right, we think about fusionism. And I actually am not as concerned about the future of fusionism, which I think is actually doing pretty well even in today's Republican Party. We can talk about that if we want to. But what interests me is the rise of conspiracy theory, which is not, I think, just on the right, but is particularly pronounced on the right now. And that, of course,
and historically, almost always comes with populism.
Yes. And you can see the differing ways in his career Bill tried to deal with it. I mean, if you think back to his book with Bozell, McCarthy and His Enemies, that is a book that tries to deal with McCarthy by creating a kind of McCarthyism that is totally abstracted from the actual behavior of Senator McCarthy. And it just, I think it fundamentally does not work. And then about 10 years later, the confrontation with the Birch Society, you see a kind of, well, look, this is, even there, he tries. He tries to keep them in the tent and give them, and put them in a better direction, and it just fundamentally fails, and he has to say, even at the cost of quite a few subscribers, no.
Let's talk about the future. We kind of traced very briefly the history, and so before we turn to the audience for some questions. Yuval, we have this moment, we talked about the rise of a post-liberal right. Jonah talked about the gravitational pull of Donald Trump on the Republican Party and on the right. What are the prospects for an American conservatism that kind of starts from, as you put it, Buckley's position of gratitude and appreciation rather than we have to defeat our enemies before they destroy us?
In your opening, Matt, in referencing that we would talk about the future, you called it the undiscovered country, which is a term that Shakespeare uses to refer to death.
I'm aware.
I am hopeful that is not the future of the coalition we're talking about. I think that the secret for both parties in thinking about how to strengthen their coalitions going forward is to begin by recognizing that what they're doing now is not working. And that's actually strangely difficult to understand in this moment, because we've lived through now a quarter century or so of 50-50 politics in which very narrow elections are interpreted as big victories and leave the winning party thinking that it's on a glide path, doing exactly what it needs to do, and it's all working out great, without noticing that they won 49% of the vote and their leader is 80%. That's where both parties were after the last two elections. And the fact that we are at 50-50, that there's just not been a real landslide election in a long time, suggests to me that neither party coalition is really onto what it would take to succeed in a durable way in 21st century America. And the left now is asking itself questions that suggest it recognizes that, but if the next election is 50-50, just slightly their way, I have no doubt that they will stop asking those questions. I think the question is, how do you get to a place where you're thinking, what can we offer the public that will have broad appeal, relatively broad appeal, even in a divided, polarized society. And I actually think that the broad outlines of Buckley's recipe as applied to the needs of a political movement continue to make sense as an answer to that question, which is, generally speaking, that you have to offer the country an approach to peace and prosperity rooted in a love of country. That's what the right's tried to offer. Peace and prosperity, these are very vague terms. And peace can look like staying out of trouble in the world, or peace can look like being very active in defending the peace of the world. The right's done both of those things. I think if you ask voters today, what are Republicans or Democrats offering you, it would not be easy to answer that question regarding either party. Because in a 50-50 moment, each party offers relief from the possibility, the horrible, unbearable possibility that the other party might win. And that's the essence of what both parties offer, is if they win, we are all lost. That's not enough to build a broad and durable coalition. And to me, that means that a winning formula has to start from what we love, what we want more of. And that, to me, does suggest that the right has to ground its approach to the public in a more conservative message, in a sense that this country is awesome. It is not a festering, burning garbage pile. That is a strange way to talk to the next generation, and it's not true even a little bit. And that in order for this country to thrive, it has to build on the foundation of its founding ideals and of its achievements. I think that the right has to focus on new issues. It can't be a repeat of Reaganism. There are new issues. The ends of Ronald Reagan's sentences are not the way to win the public anymore, even if the beginnings are still pretty useful. They have to talk about the ways in which people feel the world is out of control, in the culture, in technology, in foreign policy, in immigration, in all these areas where I think the right can certainly have a winning message now. They're not in a great place to do it in this moment, and I think it's going to take more than populism, though the winning message will have a significant dose of populism in it. I do think there has to be some recovery of the logic of Buckley's coalition. And so we do have a lot to learn from his story and his successes.
Ramesh, just briefly before we turn to the audience, I think you and I just recently read in The Economist, the Lexington columnist, all agree that the person who stands at the moment of being having the greatest chance of being the next president is J.D. Vance. So how should conservatives approach J.D. Vance, who clearly agrees with us on many issues, but certainly not on several significant ones?
Well, I used to agree more with Vance than I do these days, and I hope that in the future we'll agree again more. I mean, maybe he's not done evolving. He's shown a certain degree of flexibility in his political views. But I think, I think that this is a time of great ideological flux. Trump unsettled a lot of what conservatives and Republicans stood for, but has not really imposed a new vision on the Republican Party or the conservative movement, in part because he doesn't actually possess one himself. And we've seen how that plays out in foreign policy, especially over the last 2 weeks, when a lot of people who were confident about what they thought Trumpism was turned out not to have consulted with Donald Trump himself. Vance is offering a kind of Trumpism, a kind of thoroughly worked out version of an ideology. And one of the things that we're going to find out, if to the extent that he stays with that, because some of the details have not been worked out, is how much of the appeal of Trumpism or of Trump is personality, and how much of it is a particular political program. I think that's just been an open question in our politics for 10 years that will not be capable of being answered until Trump is off the scene.
So I just want to add one really quick point. Libertarians kind of got some bashing on here, and I take a backseat to no one on my capacity to bash libertarians. But I think you raised the idea earlier that someone did, that we're starting to look more like the pre-war right. And I think it's important, I think we can all basically agree that the the most concrete area of public policy is economics, right? I mean, it's like a lot of stuff is atmospheric, but economics is like where the rubber hits the road on public policy. And for years, I always used to say that, all this talk about libertarians and conservatives parting ways and, all that kind of stuff during the great libertarian panic of 2007, April to May of 2007.
I still carry the scars.
War is gross. The point I always make is that you talk to a normal any conservative, you say, okay, who are the conservative economists? And you would say Milton Friedman and Tom Sowell and Friedrich Hayek, and all the public choice guys and all that. There wasn't such a thing as truly non-libertarian economics on the right for most of my life. Now there is. And Orrin Cass's project looks much more like something from the old right. And I could actually argue it looks also a lot like the old left. And the approach to trade certainly has its resemblances to some of the stuff in the 1930s and the 1830s. And I think that is something that the Overton window, which a phrase I hate, I wish we could close the Overton window on the phrase Overton window, but has moved sufficiently that is now considered, it is no longer dogma on the right to be a free marketer.
Right.
And that is going to have cascading consequences for a really long time. I remember, just to put a context on this, I remember Ramesh wrote a piece for National Review about Pat Buchanan in the 1990s called Conservative No More. And it was all because he'd become a protectionist and a sort of pre-war statist on those kinds of issues.
Well, I also thought that opposing U.S. entry into World War II was a mistake.
Yeah, well, that's problematic too. Well, and that's a popular thing now too, right? I mean, like the Lindbergh point of view gets a lot of
crazy
air
point of view of mine.
from like Tucker Carlson and that crowd as well. And so asking ourselves what was in the water in the 1930s that made a lot of those people think that way, and why has it come back now? Because it turns out that Buchanan was just a harbinger of this disillusion of consensus on the right.
So just to dive back into this thing, one difference I think between the pre-World War II right and the sort of contemporary post-liberal-ish right is that pre-war right did understand itself to be extremely constitutionalist. I mean, if you think back, think of Coolidge's remarks in 1926 on the 4th of July. That created a certain set of limits on it that I think just don't obtain because post-liberalism has so much assimilated the progressivism that it claims to be against. The pre-war right was not, for example, in favor of rampant unilateral executive tariff setting.
Right.
There was a perfect understanding that those sorts of things had to go through Congress.
I think it's a very good point. I would also point out, this is where I thought you were going to go, that the old right also, first of all, didn't really think of itself as a right. It was a very just loosey-goosey, weird bunch of cranks and curmudgeons. But it also understood itself to be out of step with the country, right? They were called the superfluous men, right? It was a reference to Russian literature, but like Nock and all of those guys, Mencken, they did not see themselves as the next big thing. They saw themselves as these vestigial guys on the periphery as society's going the wrong direction without them.
A remnant, one might say.
One might even say a remnant. And the radical nature of a lot of the new right people today is they really do think they are on the precipice of power, the vanguard. They're and I think some of them are totally deluded cosplayers, but they do have a sense of an inevitability to their rule.
I think these 2 points are related, right? The attitude toward the Constitution, it seems to me, is also a function of the way in which they feel the system prevents them from bringing into reality the actually existing majority that is behind them. There's a that pre-war right was a reaction against Woodrow Wilson in its foreign policy and in its constitutionalism. Today's new right is very Wilsonian. Its attitude about the nature of the system, the problems with the system, about presidential power, only the president wins a national election, so speaks for the whole country. This is all straight out of Wilson's playbook, and I think that
And Stephen Miller recently said almost verbatim that quote.
Yeah, I think that comes from this same sense that actually the country is with us. It's the Constitution that prevents us from getting done what we want, and that's not generally an attitude that ends well.
Well, we have, because of the loquacity, to use a Buckley word, of our panelists, about time for one audience question. So, Peter. Just wait for the microphone. Guy's coming.
Thank you all very much. This is terrific. One of the nice references early on to Bill was his temperamental inclination towards libertarianism, both from a personality standpoint, but also his tremendous sense of ordered liberty and how one could become free and have a libertarian society if you had this kind of system. It reminds me of one of the most powerful essays that appeared in National Review that I think showed the limits of Bill's libertarianism to some extent. And I always sort of thought of it as a Rosetta Stone. It was the one that he recruited Whittaker Chambers to write on Ayn Rand. And I think that what that showed to me, and it had a terrific impact on me, kept me from being too libertarian, but it showed me that his view of libertarianism and ordered liberty was also conditioned by a sense of religious faith and what human beings really were meant to be. Be interested in your thoughts on that.
You know, Yuval, maybe you can address this, because one thing I did want to bring up was a little-known Buckley book called Gratitude, which I know played a very significant part in your own intellectual formation.
Yeah, first of all, I very much agree that essay just has so much in it of what Buckley and of what the right ended up having to offer America. I think it's a little unfair libertarians to say that Ayn Rand is a libertarian. That's not quite right, I think. But
That's tomorrow's panel.
yeah. But there is, I think, an element that has to be thought through, which seemed to be for Buckley rooted in religion, and is for a lot of conservatives rooted in religion, a sense that the world in which we live is really ultimately an unbought grace, a gift we don't deserve, and that we therefore have to start with a sense that what we have is great, and what's best about it needs to be preserved, what's worst about it needs to be improved by building on the better. That attitude, which just approaches the world not with urgent anger, but with a kind of solicitude, is, I think, just very important to any healthy form of the politics of the right. It's missing generally in the left's politics, it's missing in some of the right's politics, and it's a lot of what the right can offer a free society. A sense that we can change a lot of things about this world, but we have to start by recognizing that there is a lot of good in it, and that we did not create that good, and therefore it's incumbent on us to see to it that it's preserved somehow.
I'm trying to remember, or maybe one of you will know, that somewhere Bill says that a conservative need not be religious, but does need to have respect for the transcendent.
Yeah.
And that was what was finally the dividing line between him and Rand.
You know, it's interesting, too. One of his later books was Nearer My God, his religious memoir, published in the late 90s, early aughts. And he had trouble writing that book because I think it was actually too powerful for him, his devout Catholic faith. And that's his Catholicism, by the way, is another way in which he was an outsider to mainstream America.
Not quite a WASP.
No, not at all. But it was an extremely important part of his vision of the cosmos and of America's place in it, and of the importance of the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to this. I mean, this is a very Yuval Levin channeling Burke point, but like the essence of sort of Burkean conservatism is to say any principle can go wrong if you take it too far. And one of the great things about American conservatism is fusionism is its dogmatic acceptance that some of our commitments are in tension with some of our other commitments. Yeah. Liberty and order, freedom and virtue, all of that stuff, right? I I think Tanenhaus makes way too big a deal about the fact that Buckley couldn't finish his magnum opus on conservatism. I would have loved it if he had. And I really like that it was Revolt Against the Masses as the title. That's sort of where I'm at these days. But even though I think he makes too big a deal about it, I think one of the things, I like to think that one of the things that made it difficult for him, knowing what he had written about conservatism, is that he understood that point. And that this sort of is getting to my point about how, like, the tensions of American conservatism, like called American patriotism, they're not dogmatic and doctrinaire. They're written on the human heart. They're written on the American heart. We're all a little Rousseauian. We're all a little Lockean. And so when I think Bill did not approach questions by stating, okay, what is the conservative position on this? That dictates my position. He approached things saying, what is the right position on this? And I'll make a conservative case for it. And so, like, it's funny. I mean, I was always more on the more libertarian end of things at NR in my 20 years there. But I passionately disagreed with Bill and with Ramesh and with Rich and the magazine's editorial position on the drug war. I was not for drug legalization. But Bill was, and it was a libertarian position. And he just thought it was the right position, and he made a case for it. And I think that it's an important thing not to sort of try to cram excessive abstraction on who Bill was. He was like, you can be a libertarian, you don't have to believe in God, but like, you can only go this far with that stuff before I'm going to say, whoa, 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 I'm throwing a flag on this. And I think that was his approach to a lot of things.
Let me just try to squeeze in one more question here from John Gizzi. That you get it over there before we close.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm glad you brought up William Buckley's faith, because one of the things that attracted even people who were not political in the 1960s and 70s was his contumacious opposition to the excesses of the Second Vatican Council and the attempt at reforms in his own church, which still is a bedeviling problem for the Catholic Church. And I've wondered, he spelled it out so well and why so many Catholics were dismayed. How would he have felt about the efforts of young people, many of whom, all of whom, do not remember the pre-conciliar church, never were in it, but who want it back today?
Well, there's so many questions where you wonder what Bill would have made of it, and but this one I think you can actually answer, which is I think he would have been delighted by that tendency. The other thing I'd say about his faith is it also helps explain the character of his politics to some degree, because the thing that's hard for people who didn't know him well maybe to grasp is politics was actually not one of his top 5 the most important passions. It was well behind literature,
Music,
Bach, or peanut butter,
sailing,
or and it helped put politics in perspective for him.
We're drawing to a close, so I thought I would end with a Buckley anecdote, which is that upon the conclusion of Firing Line, which ran for 1,500 episodes and 33 years, Buckley made an appearance on one of his favorite programs, Nightline, anchored by Ted Koppel. And at the end of the program, after what must have been the 100th time that Ted Koppel had interviewed Bill Buckley over the years, Ted Koppel asked, "Mr. Buckley, do you have anything more to say?" To which Buckley replied, "No." Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you again.
I wanted to hear Yuval Levin on Vatican II.